Welcome back one and all. Trust you enjoyed your lunch, and delighted to kick off the afternoon session with two speakers. Eddie Tuttle is going to do an introduction, and Paul Nash take over then. So Eddie is Director of Policy, Research and Public Affairs with the Chartered Institute of Building, and just let's acknowledge the lads who travelled from the UK to be with us today. CIOB were the first and inaugural sponsor of our conference when it started in 2011. There was a lot of hard work at the time by Joe Collier, Thomas Lenine from Western Branch CIOB, helped us sort out sponsorship with CIOB nationally, and that's endured to this day, and we're very thankful and very appreciative of that. Joining Eddie today is Paul Nash, is past president of CIOB. Paul is currently a member of the Industry Safety Steering Group and Procurement Advisory Group, which was set up to advise the UK government on building safety in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire. Paul also chaired the CIOB's Construction Quality Commission, which was established to investigate the issue of quality in construction and what needs to be done to improve it. He's followed high-profile incidents such as the Edinburgh Schools reports and where blocks fell off the front of the schools, Grenfell Tower, and of course ourselves in Ireland have had similar issues over recent years. So today the gents will consider quality, competence and professionalism in the post-Grenfell world. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eddie Tuttle, the Director for Policy and Research at the Chartered Institute of Building. Just a few words about the CIOB. We are the largest professional body for construction management in the world. We have 45,000 members. 80% of those are based in the UK and Ireland. We have widespread global reach in the Far East, with sizable membership in China and Hong Kong. We also have members in the Middle East, Malaysia, Oceania, and the Americas as well. I mean, it goes without saying, we actually don't have that long this afternoon, so I'm quite keen to get into the meat of the conversation and presentation. But quality, professionalism, and competence are issues very much to the fore in the UK following the incidents at Grenfell and the Dame Judith Hackett review and report. And, you know, there's serious questions being asked about how we, as professional bodies and as professionals on the ground, actually deliver quality products that actually stand up to the right level of standards and meet the right requirements in terms of product as well. So a number of issues that Paul will take you through from a UK perspective. I can say that a number of the issues that have occurred in the UK are also issues that affect all parts of the globe as well, and there's been incidences in Malaysia, Australia, Hong Kong, China, America as well, which have had similar consequences in their own ways as Grenfell has had in the UK. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Eddie. Good afternoon, everyone. I know what it's like to be sat out there after lunch, so I'm going to try and keep this as moving as quickly as possible, trying to keep it as interesting as possible. I think there's an opportunity later for some questions and answers later on in the session. So if anyone's got any burning question, please do keep hold of them and we'll hopefully have a chance to answer them at the end. So in this presentation, I want to take you back first of all in time, and I want to take you back to 2017 when Eddie and I actually got a phone call from the Minister of Housing in Scotland to say, would you come up to a roundtable meeting we're having to discuss the findings of a report into schools, primary schools in Edinburgh. I've got to be honest with you, I didn't know anything about this until I turned up at this session. But what I learned during the course of that round table concerned me. As someone who'd been in the industry for a number of years, I saw an issue that, for me, pointed to some fundamental problems. But the most shocking thing for me was this statement from the report, which was that if it wasn't for a matter of timing and luck, then there would have been a number of injuries or fatalities. And to put that in perspective, that wall is where school children would queue up in the morning to go into their lessons. And I said to Eddie when I came out, I said, Eddie, I don't get this. I mean, I started out in construction on sites as a site manager and then moved into consultancy. I said, but this is basic building technology. These aren't complicated buildings. This is a cavity wall. How could this happen? And this wasn't just one school. This was 17 schools with exactly the same issues. It so happened that actually in the same month this report came out, announcing that Bovis were having to set aside £7 million to compensate their customers for poor quality homes. And again, it was a statement from their interim chief executive. The chief executive before him had obviously left as a consequence of this, which basically said, and if you read between the lines of that, we were really putting cost and time ahead of quality. So what was suffering? Well, ultimately quality. And as we know, even today, that is still very much an issue for the house building industry. It was shortly followed by this report, which was produced by YouGov on behalf of the housing charity Shelter. And this found that in England, and this is not just restricted to England, I would hasten to add, but this report was focused on England, over 50% of new build houses were suffered from defects of one sort or another. And again, what interested me was this quote from the report, which said that really the system was failing families. So this wasn't just about our industry, this was about the impact our industry was having on people's lives and their livelihoods, and I'll come back to that in a short while. So clearly there was an issue with the industry. Coincidentally, and I wrote a piece at the time as a consequence of this, I stumbled upon this report into a fire in which 6 people had lost their lives in Southwark in July 2009, Lakanal House. Now, for those of you who've been following the Grenfell inquiry, if you haven't already, you'll be aware of Lakanal House. You'll certainly hear a lot more people talking about it over the coming weeks and months of the inquiry, because it's incredibly relevant, because many of the faults that were identified that led to this fire were actually faults that would later on come to be part of the cause of the Grenfell Tower fire. Fundamentally, the report found there were breaches of fire-resistant structures, a lack of compartmentation in suspended ceilings, and a failure to provide smoke seals around doors. And interestingly enough, this issue around the whole issue of fire breaks, fire stopping, was also an issue for the Edinburgh Schools report, because again, if you look at Edinburgh Schools, the report points to the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that the gable end wall collapsed, actually the lack of fire stopping meant that in the event of a fire, it would have been fatal anyway. Now this is interesting, because doing what I do, and I spend a lot of time reading and a lot of time keeping up to date with what's going on, you still stumble every now and then upon a quote from an old report that just causes you to stop. And this was actually something that came out in the inquest in March 2013, which actually pointed to the fact that the cladding was also an issue that contributed to the spread of fire in the case of Lakanal House. Wasn't just an issue in the UK either, because the following year, after the inquiry, after the investigation into the Lakanal House fire, there was a fire at a tower block in Melbourne, Australia. And again, in this case specifically, one of the issues highlighted was the use of aluminium composite material panels. So we could see here that there were some strong indicators that there were some underlying issues. In this case, there were no fatalities, and the report specifically points to the fact that the presence of sprinklers and the fire alarm systems were a contributor to the fact that nobody lost their lives in this fire. And then, as we all know, in June 2017, on the 14th of June, there was the fire at Grenfell Tower, which claimed the lives of 72 people. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that a little bit later on in the presentation. So from the CIB's perspective, we knew that this was an issue for the industry. It was an issue of quality, it was an issue of standards, and ultimately it was now an issue also of building safety, the safety of those people who use the buildings that we create. We felt that we needed to act, we needed to do something about that. So in June 2017, we established and launched a commission of past presidents. And the purpose of that commission really was to investigate the issue of quality in construction. and what needed to be done to improve it. And we decided from our point of view, and it'll be interesting because you'll see some of the feedback we had from people when we looked into this, that what we really wanted to do was that we wanted to encourage and promote a culture of quality. And this word pride came up time and time again. We wanted to instill pride in the buildings and infrastructure that we created. But we also appreciated that in order to do that, in order to understand what the underlying issues are, we had to really understand the behaviours, both at an individual and a corporate level. And importantly, we wanted to understand not just those issues or behaviours that were preventing good quality on site, but also those that were promoting good quality outcomes. So in October 2017, we issued a call for evidence because what we wanted was feedback from our members and more widely across the industry into what people were seeing in their day-to-day lives on construction projects. What I'd like to do now is share with you some of the feedback that we received. So one of the questions we asked, the first question we looked at, was the management of quality. And we asked the question, do you believe that the current management of quality is adequate in terms of supervision? 76% of respondents said no. In terms of sign-off, 84% of respondents said no. And in terms of workmanship, 82%. So it was clear to us that from the perspective of the industry, there were serious concerns about the way in which quality was being managed in our industry. We then looked at the issue of regulation, codes and standards, and we asked, do you think that existing regulations, codes and standards are adequate to achieve good quality construction? In this case, 55% of respondents said no. Not as significant, but still the majority. And finally, we looked at the issue of education in the sector. And we asked, is construction quality taught effectively in educational establishments? 74% said no. Interestingly enough, on the Commission of Past Presence, we had Professor Roger Flanagan, who had already put his hand up to the fact that from an academic perspective, there was too much focus on quality systems and not enough on how you actually physically deliver quality on site. And we looked at certification systems. Are they fit for purpose? And 54% said no. So we had quantitative data back from those who'd responded, which kind of underlined the issues that we had, but not really pointing to what the solutions would be. But we also had an awful lot of qualitative responses. People wrote reams and reams to us about their own experiences and what they saw as being some of the underlying issues. And I'd like to share some of those with you. First of these may be not so surprising for those of us on construction sites, too much reliance on paper-based quality control procedures. A lack of site supervision from designers and engineers. This was a recurring theme, this issue of the decline of clerk of works role, but more specifically the lack of an assigned responsibility on site for inspection and sign-off. An acknowledgement, and this is again something that got picked up from the Hackett report, which I'll mention in a moment, is this focus on regulations being about compliance to a minimum standard only. So driving everything down to what do we need to comply with standards, not necessarily what do we need to deliver a building that is both the right quality and safe. This desire to strive for quality that went beyond the codes and the standards. The recognition as someone who started my career as a management trainee on site, that this resonated with me, that actually the experience of on-the-job training is essential. There's only so much you can learn in the classroom. Classroom training is important, but there is no substitute for experience of actually being on site and seeing how construction projects are delivered. And this theme here again, which probably will resonate with some of you, is this focus on the bottom line by the contractor, which means there aren't sufficient resources allocated to quality on projects. These were some of the quotes that we had back from people. Cost seems to be the main decider. Pride and professionalism are taking a back seat. Make it personal, generate a culture of pride, comes up again. And this recognition also that corporate culture is the starting point. So there's a complete behavioural change that's required from the top down and from the bottom up as well. So we'd issued our call for evidence, we'd collected all the data and information, now we needed to decide what we need to do to try and make a difference. So we decided to focus primarily on promoting best practice and raising standards of education in quality management. The first thing we did was we launched a 2-day construction quality management course. It's usually this point in the presentation where I ask if anyone in the room has done the course, because I'm always interested in feedback. And if anyone has and you want to come up to me afterwards and give me your feedback, I'd be very happy to receive it. The course has been very well received. I've spoken to a number of people who've been on it. Fundamentally, the course is there to explain about the fundamentals of quality management, introduce people to the relevant codes and standards, and also teach people how you apply those ideas, those principles of best practice in your day-to-day jobs as well. So it's very much a practical focus of the course as well. Last year in September, we launched a code of quality management. It's available to download. There's a link on the presentation, which I think we're intending to circulate afterwards as well. The code has 6 sections, but essentially it splits into 2 parts. The first part really provides the background, some context from an industry stance in terms of what's been happening, what else is going on in industry to try and raise standards of quality. But the bulk of the document is a practical tool. It's a quality management plan broken down by trades with guidance and reference to the relevant standards. It's very much intended to be, and I always stress this, a practitioner's tool. It's meant to be something that people take away, they take apart, and they use in their day-to-day work. And we are very keen to receive feedback from people on the code. As I said, there's a link there if anyone wants to download it. We're currently working on an update to the code, recognition that to some extent we're already getting feedback from people, but also that standards and best practice is constantly changing. And then in October last year, we launched a MOOC. Now, many of you in the room might be familiar with a MOOC. I recently became familiar with MOOC. It's for those who are uninitiated. It's a massive open online course. It's free. Anyone can go online and join in. It runs over 3 weeks, this particular course. And it's intended, again, to provide an introduction to the basic principles of quality management. But the important thing to stress about this, it's interactive. And to put that in context, we ran this course last October. We had 1,775 people participate in the course from over 110 countries. I had access. I was able to log on and see people's comments and even respond to some of the comments. It's really interesting to see how the people react and respond to not just the learning, but the comments from other people from all over the world. And if anyone's interested in the room today, again, the link is there. We've just launched the course again. Such was its success first time round. So if anyone's interested, you can go online this week. The fact it launched on the 2nd doesn't mean you missed the deadline, because you can do the course any time to suit you. And it works out roughly to be about 2 hours a week over 3 weeks. And again, if you get involved in the online forums, it can be a lot more than that, as you can imagine. But again, I'd commend the course to you. And then later this year, we're planning to pilot a quality certification scheme. Now, this will be effectively the next level on from the 2-day course to allow people basically to have a qualification in quality management. And we're basing it on our conservation certification scheme, which has also been very successful and has now been running for, I think, 3 years, about 3 years. So we have a precedent for this. The work's ongoing at the moment to try and complete this and launch a pilot. So again, watch this space. We'll keep you informed of what's happening from that perspective. So in some respects, from a CIB perspective, most of our effort and energy has been directed at trying to raise standards of education in order to promote best practice. And hopefully through that then, not just to increase the recognition and understanding, but also to promote changes in people's behaviours and attitudes on site. Because all of us in this room, whether you're in the industry, whether you're learning, or whether you've been in it for a very long time, we all have a responsibility for quality in the industry. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to say a little bit about the building safety programme and post-Grenfell. It's something, as Martin mentioned earlier, I'm very closely involved in because I sit on the Industry Safety Steering Group, which is chaired by Dame Judith Hackett, and that group is there to provide strategic level oversight of all the work that's going on across the UK government's building safety programme. So it was set up in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire, and you will see this comment appear in many of the reports about the focus really being on ensuring that residents of high-rise residential buildings are safe and feel safe now and in the future. A lot of the work to date through government has been focused on cladding replacement. I could give a whole other presentation on cladding and what's going on there, and you'll have seen a lot of reporting on this in the press, but it is an ongoing issue in the context of high-risk residential buildings. Testing of fire doors, which was a particular issue that was picked up very early on, and then the review of competencies, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. And then this independent review of building regulations and fire safety, which was led by Dame Judith Hackett. I chaired one of the working groups that fed into that report, that was specifically at procurement. That report, which has become known as the Hackett Report, is what has led now on to the recommendations that government, UK government, are looking to adopt. There's a link there if anyone wants to see any more information about that. The final report, Building a Safer Future, which came out in May 2018, identified 4 key issues: ignorance, indifference, a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, and inadequate regulatory oversight and enforcement tools. It's a pretty damning report. It's entirely independent, which is the whole point of it, but it makes uncomfortable reading for those of us in the industry. But it's also a wake-up call to the industry that we need to change the way that we design, procure, construct, and manage buildings. This quote, which has now become quite often quoted from the report, introduced this concept of the race to the bottom, where there was an insufficient focus on delivering best quality to ensure that residents are safe and feel safe, and it being an underlying cultural issue. I mentioned earlier about competency. There's a lot more I could say about that, but we don't have time, unfortunately. But I want to say a bit about competency. One of the key streams of work that's been undertaken under the Building Safety Programme has been to look at competency across the industry and what work needs to be done to raise competency across a number of disciplines. To do this, a competence steering group was set up. That group, in August last year, published its interim review. And this was all really about trying to raise standards of competency in industry. Put this in context, there are 12 working groups and an overarching competency body report, which is the system that effectively will embrace all of these different competencies. But you can see the range of disciplines that are covered by this review of competency. CIOB has been actively involved in a number of those, including procurement, project management, site supervision as well. The significant thing to say about this, and say we don't have time to talk about it unfortunately in this presentation, but is there are a number of new roles that are going to be created through the new building safety system. One of those under Working Group 8 is that of the Building Safety Manager. But existing roles under the CDM roles, the Principal Designer and Principal Contractor, are also going to be enhanced in the context and have statutory responsibilities under the new Building Safety Act, which we expect to come into force next year. So there are significant changes coming down the pipeline in terms of the industry and the roles and responsibility of those, specifically those working on high-rise or high-risk residential buildings. Just to give some context in case you're wondering, HRRBs at the moment broadly are a category of building in which people sleep overnight. At the moment it's 18 metres and above, although the Secretary of State announced back in January that threshold is being reviewed in respect of inflammable materials and sprinklers and could be reduced to 11 metres. So again, it's a constantly moving debate about what is an HRRB and what height of building is technically classed as high. What was interesting for me, and this is a quote that was repeated in the Raising the Bar report, is this quote which they referred to, taken from the Building a Safer Future report. And this is another quote from Dame Judith. And I think the important thing for me about this quote, and you'll hear this theme appearing again, is this issue of leadership, is that what government in the UK and those who have been tasked with trying to drive forward the change in industry keep referring back to is the lack of, and therefore the need for, leadership from the industry. And this comes back to our own findings in terms of this cultural change, this behavioural change needs to start from the top down. So just to wrap up, there's a lot to digest there. I do appreciate that, and thank you for your attention. There is a lot more, and maybe if you have any questions, we can pick it up a bit later. What have I learned on this journey? Well, the first thing I would say I've learned on this journey is that what we do as an industry matters. It's important. It's important to the economy. You know, a significant proportion of GDP is created by our industry, but it's also important to society. And for me, when it comes to that, it underlines the fact that what we do and how we do it makes a difference to people's lives and livelihoods, and particularly when we get it wrong. So for me, it's not just about doing it right, it's about doing the right thing. And this talk is about professionalism in the context of quality, and I think that as professionals, we all have a responsibility for the reputation of industry and to do the right thing. And that also extends to the well-being and the safety of those who use the buildings and the infrastructure that we create. And as you probably have gathered from this presentation, there's still a lot of work to do. And everybody in this room, we all have a responsibility, not only to keep up to date with what's happening in industry, to make sure that we're passing that message on. And I'd like to finish with this quote by the father of quality management, W. Edwards Deming. Quality is everyone's responsibility, and we never have to stop getting better. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Now, you might just settle, please, students at the back there. So we're just going to, before we move on, we just thank Eddie and Paul for their contribution. And before we move on to the next speaker, we just do the competition to win the iPad. So winning person out, and the rules would have to be in the room to actually collect the prize. Otherwise, we draw again, is Noel Clark from the University of Limerick. Noel, come down. So the prize is sponsored by TopCon, and with Jonathan Argue here from TopCon to present the prize to Noel. Now, our next speaker is Alan Barnes. Alan's from Colin Construction and is currently Ireland's Construction Manager of the Year for 2019. His award comes as a result of his work on the Scots Church in Lower Abbey Street, Dublin, received a gold medal at the Chartered Institute of Build and Construction Manager of the Year Awards dinner at Croke Park Stadium last year. The CMYA in Ireland is recognised as achievement of those leading complex and challenging projects. CMYA is a prestigious honour within the industry and one that's much coveted for its recognition of the excellence and exceptional skills of the recipients. The project that led to Alan's nomination and gold medal win was the conservation and refurbishment of the existing Scots Presbyterian Church, a protected structure on Abbey Street. The work involved the erection of a complex 7-storey eco-skeleton steel frame around the existing church, providing state-of-the-art office accommodation as part of the planned expansion of office headquarters for the church in Lower Abbey Street. The risks and challenges encountered on this project required ingenuity, dedication and great construction management skills, delivered in an extremely tight budget and tight time frame. So I now ask Alan to give his overview of this complex and challenging project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your very generous introduction there, and thanks everybody for hanging around to listen to me presentation. I'm here obviously today just to talk about the building that's behind me, Scots Presbyterian Church. Just a couple of things to point out about it before I start is it's three buildings. There's the church on the left, which is the main church building, and then inside the glass building there's another, it's called a church hall, and then obviously the new building that came around that building. Just before I start, I guess I just want to give you a bit of brief background on my own career journey to get to this point. I graduated from Bolton Street. I studied construction technology in 2002. I graduated from Bolton Street and completed my degree in the University of South Wales in Cardiff in 2003. After that, I started into the industry as a site engineer. I worked for Crampton's for a number of years in Dublin. Spent a couple of years travelling. I worked in Canada as an engineer in the construction industry as well in 2004, 2005, before coming home and starting to work for Colin, who I still work for today. So when I started working for Colin in 2007, it was as a site engineer, and I progressed through the ranks with Colin from engineer to site manager to where I am today as project manager, which kind of brings us up to date to where we are in 2016. The building behind me was about to get going. So what I have here is just a slideshow. There's a couple of videos in it, lots of glossy pictures for everybody for after lunch to look at. The building, when we took it over in 2016, it was effectively a church. You know, as you would see, a number of buildings around any city, around Galway, around Dublin, that was highly kind of carbonated. It was unused for about 20 years. The client, the VHI, bought it. Their head office was next door to it, but they didn't know what to do with it at the time, so they just bought the building so as it wouldn't be redeveloped by somebody else. And that's the state that we had found the building in. It was originally designed by an architect from Limerick called William Fogarty, and it was the first foundation stone was laid in 1868. So it was almost 150 years later when we came and took it over. The project, just particulars, obviously the client is the VHI. Everybody's heard of the VHI. Their headquarters is based on Abbey Street in Dublin. The architects are the same architects that did, if anybody was familiar with the Borgosh Energy Theatre in Grand Canal in Dublin, Colley's A. O'Connell. And they also designed the Marker Hotel, which is on Grand Canal in Dublin also. The engineers are Casey O'Rourke. The contractor is who I work for, Colin Construction. The duration was just under 2 years, and the cost was to be 18 million euros. Project scope was the enlargement of the VHI offices. So VHI office is just this building here next door. That's their head office. The restoration of the Presbyterian Church and the church hall, which is the building within the building. The construction then of the contemporary diagrid structure up and above the other church hall, and then the creation of a glazed ground floor link between the existing church building. So effectively this picture would have been taken maybe a week after we got the site. You see this is the church hall building where the exoskeleton building is about to be built over. This is the main church, which was then finally turned into their reception. And we ended up demolishing part of this building and creating a link building at a number of different levels into their offices to give a continuous flow from one building to the other. Key challenges for me from buildability perspective and a construction perspective, there was a number of challenges. The image that you see on the right here was taken out of the tower crane, so we only had a single tower crane on it, which in the city centre location, you know, everything is about the tower crane. Everything comes in, has to be lifted, and everything has to be taken down. So it's all about a tower crane, and if you only have one, that gives you constraints straight away. This small little yard here was where the entire project was built from. This building belongs to the VHI as well, and they were kind enough to give us that yard as our laydown areas. So that is where everything was brought in and out of prior to being lifted into location by the crane. The building was hemmed in on three sides, the building site, by this building on one side, the Lewis on the other side, and the Abbey Theatre on the third side. So all our deliveries had to come up and down this one-way street and be offloaded in here and then lifted up into position by the tower crane. So I've just noted off a couple of key challenges there. As it says, the city centre location, health and safety, massive challenge. Biggest challenge on the project was the health and safety, not only for the construction workers, but obviously for the surrounding buildings and for people, pedestrians and civilians that would be in the area. Conservation of a 150-year-old building is a challenge enough without everything else on top of it. Access and storage, as I just said, access, for workers getting to the work area, and also access to store materials prior to being put into position. Steel frame and the facade interface, so there was massive engineering coordination that required from that, and then there was some finishes inside the exposed concrete coffered ceilings. So logistics, communications, and the surrounding buildings, as I said already, one of the biggest aspects of my role as the project manager was communicating with the surrounding, the neighbours and any buildings. The Abbey Theatre, which is on one side, which is just here. Anybody who's familiar with Dublin will know where the Abbey Theatre is. As I said, this is the VHI's current head office. That's their client. There's a Lewis line, the train line that runs up and down Abbey Street, just right in front of the site. And then each one of these are all individual businesses, and just out of shot there is Liberty Hall, which is just here, so everybody's familiar with where Liberty Hall is. So liaising with the Abbey Theatre, as I said, I used to have meetings with them during the initial phase when we were piling, and when the foundations were being dug. I used to meet with the Abbey Theatre once a week to understand their theatre times, when they were doing kind of sound plays, or when they were rehearsing, or when they were loading in, because obviously they didn't want people piling 5 meters away from their main stage when they're trying to rehearse for a show. So we were continuously meeting with them to understand what it was they were trying to do, and then work around that as best we could so that we didn't effectively tread on people's toes. Just-in-time deliveries were a massive thing for us, calling on the deliveries so that you didn't have rows of trucks showing up with facade panels that you didn't actually need. We didn't have anywhere to store it, so everything had to be called on when we needed it. And also a really handy tool that we used extensively was storyboards and letter drops for the surrounding buildings and businesses. We would do storyboards explaining to people exactly when a particular task was going to happen and how they were going to be impacted and how long they were going to be impacted for. And we found after a while, generally, if you communicated enough to people in the surrounding businesses, disarming them to a certain extent, they understand that you have to get a job to get on with, but as long as you keep telling them, then they were generally happy enough. So that's just, the picture just gives you a kind of indication there as to where the building, this is the new building that went up, and how tight everything was down there in that area. Health and safety considerations, as I said already, managing, there's a lot of planning with our own safety team that went into how you erect a steel structure like this. That was our hoarding line, and 3 meters in front of the hoarding line there was a train going up and down every 4 minutes, which is the Lewis. So there was huge considerations that went into any crane oversails, the impacts that we had, talking to Transport Ireland and talking to Transdev, and understanding what it was that their concerns were, and then trying to come up with ways to mitigate, so to effectively allow us to get on with the job. Public interface as well, we were really, really close to the public. There's a lot of kind of unsociable behaviour down there in that part of town. A lot of people doing heroin in the back lane that we had used to kind of stepping over people. There was always incidences up and down the lane, so that was a big aspect of the job. And then, working on this leading edge here. So as the roof went up, at some point when the facade panels went on, vertical facade panels, there was also a horizontal rain screen panel, so we had to completely remove the edge protection at one stage, and there would have been guys working along here strapped on harnesses, so if you were walking past on the footpath down here on the road and you would look up, what you might see is 3 or 4 guys up on the roof with absolutely no edge protection bar what they had onto their backs. So we ended up inviting the HSA down to site. We took the unusual step. HSA, where their head office is not too far from where that site was. So we took the unusual step where we actually invited them around to the site, explained to them what we were going to do. These were the measures that we were going to have in place, and if they had anything to advice to give to us, then we were able to write them into the method statements. So we were happy that we weren't going to be effectively doorstepped by them when they come down and potentially shut down the job. We invited them in and told them what we were going to do, and then they were very happy about what we were trying to do. The actual restoration of the building itself, so it wasn't in a bad condition. The church itself, the stone on the outside was probably general to what you would see throughout a lot of the city. The stone was probably heavily carbonated. You see the black carbon that would have built up on a lot of the cane stone, and similarly around a lot of the door heads up around here. That all had to be cleaned off. There were specialists that came in and they washed down the whole building, and there was stone repairs, like you can see here. The cane stone, which is quite a brittle stone. There was stone grafts taken from other areas of the building, and they were regrafted into these areas. Repointing, there was extensive repointing as well throughout the building. We re-roofed both buildings, the church and the church hall next to it. Again, at the outset of the project, there wasn't supposed to be, I think there was an allowance in the bill to replace 40 tiles, and that was just due to some leaks that they could see inside the church. But when we got up a bit closer to the actual roof, it was badly degraded on one side, the slate coming from the west. On the east, it wasn't too bad, but the clients said, look, the building site at the moment, we may as well spend the money and re-roof both buildings. So we ended up re-insulating the church and the church hall and completely re-slated it. And that's what it looked like when it was cleaned up. So that is now the front entrance and the reception to the VHI. So if you're calling in as a member of the public, you go straight into the church, and that's their reception. When we took over, that's images of the inside of the church itself. It was effectively what you would think the church looks like. An organ, had an altar and had all the pews and the tiles, but it had been completely disused for about 20 years. And the VHI were using it effectively as a store. So structurally, their hands were tied structurally with what they could do, because they had a conservation order on it. So what we ended up doing was we effectively removed everything from the inside. The organ was taken. They weren't allowed to scrap the organ, so it was taken by I think it was the pub of Galway actually, and it might be a DJ booth somewhere around Galway maybe. It's where the organ ended up. And all the pews were sent into storage and kept. It's just another image in the inside. So that's effectively what it looked like when we took over. We had to take a metre of stone off the floor to bring it back up and to put services within the slab. There was a new slab poured. So again, something that we didn't probably think about at the beginning was how you remove a metre of stone from inside a building. So we ended up putting mini diggers inside the church itself and conveyor belts of stone running through either of the doors on the outside. Out through one of these doors, we ran conveyor belts and removed a metre of stone off the floor, completely grubbed up the floor, and then turned everything back around and imported all stone back in and poured a new floor. So something that we didn't give enough consideration to at the time, but we were quite happy with ourselves when we came up with the idea of using conveyor belts. And that's effectively what it looks like today when it was handed over. So very, very modern, still, looks like a church, but a very modern building. The VHI, that's where the customer service desk is, that's the reception desk is. And what they do, they have this screen that they installed. They can close down the area and use it for corporate events. They've watched rugby matches in there, and they could bring in catering. So it's a really interesting space, and it's well worth checking out. On culture, in Dublin, they do a cultural night once a year. And this was the first year that they opened up Scots Church, and they had 800 people in 4 hours into the building. There's a rose window. If I just go back one image there, up at the back there, just above the screen, was a key feature for the VHI. There's a rose window, is what they call it, which is effectively a stained glass window. And it was on the outside of the building, on the gable side. And obviously looked into the church, but it was in really poor condition. On the outside, the stone was very badly deteriorated, and the glass wasn't wasn't vivid in any way, so it needed a full restoration. So the whole window was removed and it was sent to a company in Navan called Glasshouse. They came and they took it all out piece by piece and they recatalogued it, took stencils, removed each piece individually, cleaned it by hand. There was 1,200 pieces in the window alone. Cleaned everything, re-leaded it, and that's a pretty clear image of what you see. From it, you can see kind of the way you have it backed here into different parts. And that's a picture of the inside. So I'm standing looking at the extension of the new building, and you can see the rose window here on the right-hand side. So it's a real feature now. You can walk up and down the stairs on one side of the building, and when you're in the church, you can see shadows of people walking past on the other side. So it's a key feature for them, and it looks fantastic. The church hall itself then, which is the second building, the building which is in the belly of the main building. Again, when we got there, the building was being used as a store, had a false ceiling in it, so there was a 150-year-old timber roof that was completely concealed. It was then removed. So that was the way we found it when we got there. And we had to take off the roof to allow a scaffolding to be built, which was then going to build the rest of the structure. So piling, there was 220 mini piles. So this is in the process of when the guys were in piling inside the church. There was probably 60 piles maybe put into the church hall, all the way around. And that's an image of what it looks like today. There was part of the roof was removed on the right-hand side to allow these balconies to fly in, so you can stand on first floor. There's another image in a moment. So where we were downstairs, that whole roof was removed to allow a scaffolding go through it. Everything was catalogued. All the sacrum boards were catalogued and numbered. The conservation architects made us do it. Take it away, store it, strip it, and then bring it back and refit it piece for piece. Exactly the way it was prior to that. So these balconies then, as you can see, are another feature when they just dip into the building. And again, that's what it looks like today. The balconies which are coming in from first floor, as I said, we removed part of the roof to allow those balconies to stick their nose into the building. And the VHI use it as what they call an innovation centre. But it's a pretty contemporary room for an old 150-year-old building. And again, this is the part of the roof that I was talking about, which was taken off, and these are now breakout little meeting spaces where people can sit, and those balconies jut into the side of the roof. And then up on the second floor level, you can see they have similar balconies which are hung using these Macaulay bars. So the whole first floor and second floor are hung from the third floor above by using those Macaulay bars to give this effect. So again, when you're standing there in that space and you see this building, this church structure within the belly of the other building, it's pretty striking and pretty impressive. It's a time-lapse video. Before I just start talking about the structure, I'll just show you a quick time-lapse video of the structure as it came up. So you can see the concrete core. First thing we did was bring up the concrete core, the lift shaft. The lift shaft took that up, and then we're starting to bring in steel. Scaffolds here starting to go up above the church hall, above the main building there at the back. So it's a really striking steel, exoskeleton steel. You can see it coming up bit by bit, being brought up on scaffolding. Just to add an insult to injury, the roof slopes in two directions. Not only does it slope from east to west, but also north to south. You can see the slope on the roof there as it comes down. And now the facade is going on here. This is the facade at the back. It's a mix. The facade is a mix of stainless steel and glass. So each of these downward triangles are stainless steel panels, and the upper triangles are glass. All glass at the front. So now most of the structure is up now at that point. fit out is going on. You can see guys out on the roof. Roof in here. Tower crane is still up, so it's probably maybe 6 or 8 months still to go. Looks like someone's having a party inside there. And again, you can see stainless steel panels here on top of that roof, so the whole it's like a stainless steel box, effectively. The outside, the external works are all being finished. Brought up. Tower crane is gone. Finishes are happening. Finishes are done outside here. That's almost it. So when you go past it at night time, then it's all different uplighters in each of the panels. In each of the facade panels has different uplighters. So on any given day, I think they have a range of 130 different colours that they can put into it. DHI's brand are purple, so generally it's lit purple. But on Paddy's Day it can be green, or Valentine's Day it can be red, or so they tend to change the colours at will. They have a little iPad where they can change the colour of the building. Just moving on, I'll just talk quickly about the steel structure. So again, it's concrete core formwork, as you saw in the video there, exoskeleton structure built entirely off tube and fit and scaffolding. Up. So what we had to do was we brought because of the building that was beneath the main structure, that gave a lot of difficulty in how we were actually going to start on the 3rd floor, which was really the first office floor, because the 1st floor and 2nd floor were hung from the 3rd floors. 3rd floor was the first floor that we were going to have to do. So we ended up building a scaffolding, leveling it to exactly the level where these floor beams had to be landed, and then setting out the floor beams individually all the way along the floor beam, and then offering up the outside of the exoskeleton frame, which would then stabilize everything as it went up. So the first thing that we did was build the scaffolding. As I said, the deck beams went in, and then the outside steel went up, offered up out of it. That is a picture of the scaffolding above the church hall. So to take the weight of the steel beams that were done on the 3rd floor, that is what we had to do above the church to try and maintain that and stabilize the building as it went up. So you can only imagine what the temporary works cert looked like for that. And it's just another image of the scaffolding again outside, so built all the way up. So at some point we kind of got hemmed in program-wise with the scaffolding, because it was taking a long time for it to go up. So we came up with the idea of, rather than it being a ground-based scaffolding, which it was at the outset for the 3rd floor beams, was that once the building got up to a certain height of steel, we transferred the scaffolding actually onto the steel structure itself, which allowed us to put out the whole centre part here. So the scaffolding is now continuing on, but we're actually now using the steel itself to build the scaffolding off, rather than it being ground-based. And that allowed us to remove the inside of the scaffolding, which then obviously meant that we could start pouring floors, and guys could start actually working in there. So we took the erection of the steel at higher level off the critical path by doing that. And then again, on the reverse of that, because of the ground-based scaffolding underneath the 3rd floor, we had to hang the scaffolding from the 3rd floor, which you can just see here in this image, to allow us to actually start re-roofing that again. So it was a real scaffolder's nightmare. And then for tolerances in the steel, people ask us how, on the X, Y, and Z axis, how do we manage to maintain the accuracy in the diagrids? So the steel erectors ended up torquing the building from one side to the other to try and get everything in as closely as possible within tolerance. And from the ground up onto the 7th floor, there was 23 mil of an error, which is effectively zero for that kind of a building. As I said earlier on, looks like a mix of stainless steel and glass. The facade, it was brought in from Turkey. Everything was made in Istanbul and brought in that way, shipped in, just in time deliveries. It's an image of the outside of it, pretty cool looking. And again, you see the triangle is used extensively everywhere you look within the building. There's a triangle being used. And then lastly, I think there's proximity to the train going past. Pause it there just before I finish. So you can see the whole west elevation, that's completely stainless steel. The whole roof is stainless steel. It was a rain screen, so there was still a felt and an insulated roof beneath it. But as you can imagine, all of these lot of buildings here belong to the Abbey Theatre, and to try and get access up to build that 7 stories with the build-up of panels, which is what the west elevation was really, really difficult to try and coordinate all of that and not to fall out with the neighbours at the same time. The VHI plan on being there for a long time to come, and instead, we'd like to be still friends with our neighbours by the end of this project, please. And similarly with this, the proximity of this building to that was a real challenge. So look, thank you for listening. Hope that was interesting.
Yeah. It's Keith. Keith? Oh, sorry, I haven't yet. I've just spotted. Now, we might just settle for our last speaker. So, just looking at that job, fascinating project, Alan, so well done on that. Final speaker today is Keith Mayo. Keith is design manager from Wills Brothers Limited. He's been appointed as part of the team for the new N5 Westport to Turlock project in Mayo. The development and overall cost of 241 million involves the construction of 20 kilometres of dual carriageway from Westport to Turlock, and the route stretches from Deer Park East in Westport to the village of Ballyneggin near Turlock, Castle Bar. In addition, we've got a 2.5 kilometre single carriageway link to the N59. So I'll ask Keith to give an overview of this project, much needed in the west of Ireland, where we've been very short of civil engineering projects in recent years. Thank you, Keith.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Martin. As I said, my name is Keith Mayock. I'm working with Wills Bros BAM joint venture, who've been appointed as the contractor for the design and build of the Westport to Turlock Road scheme. So I'm design manager for the company in relation to our design and build projects. So just an overview for those of you that aren't familiar with the scheme is there behind me. The scheme runs from the west side of Westport on the Newport Road over towards Castlebar, bypasses Castlebar on the south side, and it ties in with the existing N5 with junctions with the N84 and N60. So perhaps the next slide will give you a feel for the scheme a little clearer. So as you can see there, working from east to west, joins in on the existing N5 with a roundabout signified with the blue dot. Crosses where there's a grade separated junction, 2 grade separated junctions at the 2 yellow dots, and the scheme intersects the Westport to Dublin railway line at 2 locations where we have 2 rail bridges to construct. They're of key strategic importance to us in the construction of the job, which I'll explain later. So the scheme continues on where it crosses the old M5, there's a roundabout to be constructed there, continues on to Westport where at Knockranny it transitions into a single carriageway, and there's a number of roundabouts around the town of Westport. So as Martin said, there's been a lot of need for this scheme in the West, and it was assessed by TII and Mayo County Council under 5 main headings, those being economy, safety, environment, accessibility and integration. So in relation to the economic benefit of a project like this, primarily in the reduction of journey times. So it's estimated that over the life cycle of this project that there'll be over 12 million hours saved in commuting time for people using this road. So that has significant economic benefit to people in the area. With regards to safety, the road between Castlebar and Westport was a section of national route with particularly poor safety record. So one of the key objectives of the scheme was to improve that. So it's estimated that over the life of this scheme, there will be a reduction of 35 fatalities, 120 serious incidents, and 1,200 minor incidents. So in terms of the assessment of the scheme, there's monetary values attributed to all of those incidents, and that all feeds into the cost-benefit analysis when the scheme is being considered to go forward. So in relation to the environment, you can see that the towns of Westport and Castlebar are bypassed by the route. So there's significant environmental benefits in Westport and Castlebar in terms of the reduction of traffic, reduction of noise pollution, and the congestion associated with all the traffic going through the towns. But also between Westport and Castlebar, there's a lot of ribbon development along the existing N5. So those will all benefit from the reduction in traffic along that route also. Now, while there's benefits in those areas, there's obviously the potential for environmental impacts along the new greenfield route. Those have been avoided insofar as was practicable, and where it hasn't been the case, within the environmental statement and the contract, there's obligations where those impacts are mitigated by our design and construction methodologies. And I'll give you an example of one of them slightly later. So the fourth heading I had said was accessibility. So in relation to accessibility, the rural area between Castlebar and Westport is recognised in national policy documents as being an area of rural social exclusion. And this road is seen as improving accessibility to and between these communities. So that's another improvement. And also, in terms of integration, the project has been part of the National Development Plan for some time and Mayo County Development Plans. Just in relation to the contract, Mayo County Council are our employer for the scheme, working with TII. The employer's representative is Ronan O'Donovan Consultant Engineers, and a joint venture company of Wills Bros and BAM are the contractor for the design and construction of the scheme, and RPS Consultant Engineers are our designer, and they will also supervise the construction of the works. So we've been engaged on a public works contract for civil engineering works designed by the contractor, and as you can see on the left-hand side of the scheme, the TII project management guidelines describe the life cycle of the project across 7 main phases. So we entered into that process at stage 5, which was during the tender, at which stage we'd have been presented with the contract, the background information, and all the work that had been carried out to date. And then we started to use that to develop what's referred to as our conceptual design. So during the development of our conceptual design in conjunction with our designers, there's a lot of work to be undertaken at that phase to inform our tender. So we would have been meeting with various third-party stakeholders, utility companies, parks and wildlife, fisheries, all the different people trying to establish the requirements they're going to have that will influence the end product that we're going to ultimately have to construct. Also during that process, whilst engaging with our designers, we meet with the employer and the employer's representatives to discuss our development proposals. They're reviewed and considered and changes made as the need arises, and ultimately our tender contains a conceptual design which goes in with the submission. That conceptual design is not a detailed design by any means, and it has to be developed further during the contract phase if you're successful. So what's certified as part of your tender there is that that conceptual design represents a reasonable response to and is capable of being developed to meet the requirements of the contract. So that's the basis we go forward with our tender on. We were successful with that tendering process, so we've been appointed as contractor. We're working on the scheme for the last few months. But primarily over the last few months, what we've been doing is additional site investigations, geotechnical investigations, filling in gaps in background information provided to us, and a lot of ecological surveys, bats, badgers, birds, and everything in between. So whilst that is ongoing, our designers have been working hard, I hope, but that's going on, and also we're developing our construction programme in detail, our quality management systems for the scheme, our environmental control systems, to ensure that all of our obligations in respect to all of those items are met when construction does really get going. So our involvement in the scheme does enter into phase 7 briefly, in terms of handing over safety file, as-built information, operational manuals, and also in terms of a stage 4 road safety audit, where the safety of the scheme is considered in its operational phase. This slide gives you an overview of the broad timeline of construction of this scheme. I've discussed phase 5 tender, so we're currently in 2020. As I've said, a lot of design work is ongoing currently, site investigations, ecology. We're liaising with all the utility companies, trying to get those things sorted, OPW, culvert design. So there's a lot being done to enable the work to really get going when we start. Procurement of significant packages, particularly those elements that would be integral within the design, is also ongoing, with a view to commencing the main earthworks and drainage, hopefully not too much later in the year if the weather improves. But that will continue through the most of 2020. The structures will start in the latter half of the year, and then the structures will continue into 2021, as will drainage works, more structures, pavement will commence on into 2022, when it'll get more into finishing works and the type end product that you see when you're driving down any of our national primary routes. And then phase 7, ultimately the handover and transfer of information in relation to the asset we've constructed to the client. So I've mentioned a number of times there about the amount of third parties that are involved in the development of this scheme. So much so that there's an entire schedule in our contract that outlines to us all of the various obligations we have associated with a huge raft of third parties, be it state, semi-state and private companies. So that's an intensive process that's ongoing at the minute, and it takes a lot of management. So you'd imagine national parks and wildlife we're dealing with in relation to protected species, any licenses that may be required for disturbance of mammals. We're dealing with OPW in relation to Section 50 consents, Drainage Act in relation to culverts and water courses, Irish Rail in relation to the bridges, various utility companies with regard to their assets. And all of that feeds into the design that's ongoing. And I suppose where the risk in that comes from us, these guys aren't party to the contract. So whilst our relationships with the employers defined with periods of apply and different things, these guys sit outside of that. So you really have to engage and try and collaborate and get an appreciation of what everyone's concerns and considerations are in relation to their relevant parts to try and get to that ultimate end product. So, as I said, we're really in the design phase at this stage. So this graphic I've used to try and summarise our design process that we work on with our designers. So I suppose, having carried out a conceptual design during the tender, we're now at the stage where we're going to develop our detailed design of what we're going to actually construct. So in order to do that, we sit back, take a look at our contract requirements, the various consents and planning permissions, commitments that are made in relation to the scheme, the applicable design standards, which may not necessarily be standards current today. Most contracts would define design standards could be applicable at the contract date or the period during the tender. And it's important you work to the standards that are appropriate to what you've been engaged for. Also, the outcomes of any investigations or consultations that have been undertaken, Subsequent to carrying out the conceptual design, we have to feed that back in with our designers and ensure that those items are addressed within the development of our detailed design. And in consideration of all those things, we then decide and agree a design strategy in relation to the particular element to be designed with our designers, who then proceed on with the design. So when that design is substantially complete, we get it back from the designers for our review. And it comes in through our on-site design coordination team and is shared amongst our construction team, commercial team, health and safety. So you're getting input from the section agents who are going to build that element that you're designing, and also from your health and safety department to determine any risks that they see inherent within it, your commercial department to ensure it's economical. So there's a bit of an iteration loop that happens there, and comments go over and back between us and our designers. And ultimately, what needs updating is updated and the design is finalised. At which point that design may have to be issued back out to the consultees that I've previously identified, and those guys need to confirm that they're happy with what's contained within it. And then it moves on to the client, who has a period for objection. Should objections be raised, we revert back with the designers, make the appropriate updates, where it's recertified, and eventually we'll proceed on with construction. So this slide gives you a feel for the type of numbers involved in the earthworks. So these earthworks volumes are coming from the environmental statement, so it's what the employer had originally envisaged when they were scoping the scheme. So the road is located in naturally undulating land with a lot of drumlins, with superficial deposits of peat, alluvium and glacial till. Maybe Leo Moran and Davy Carton said it more poetically when they referred to Mayo soft and craggy boglands and tall majestic hills. We have the boglands, we don't have many hills within the scheme, unfortunately. But I suppose it gives you a feel for the type of numbers that's involved with a road project such as this, and it's a significant earth moving activity. So the graph at the bottom is a mass haul diagram that we develop to plan our works. So along the x-axis there, you have the horizontal changes along the scheme. The y-axis are volumes, with excavation volumes positive on the y, fill volumes negative on the y, with each of the colours shown the different classifications of material that we expect that we'll encounter and require as advised by our designers. The lines are how we plan to go at it, hopefully. But I suppose it all looks very accurate here, and we have so many hundreds of thousands of cube and classifications, but reality is it's based on a ground investigation that's dispersed throughout the site, containing various results at discrete locations, that's been interpreted, and then after that interpretation interpolated between to try and arrive at a set of volumes. So there's an approximate nature to what has to be undertaken, but then furthermore, in an area like this where there's a lot of fine-grained glacial tills, that type of material is particularly susceptible to moisture. So even if we anticipate it's going to be acceptable fill, dependent on the weather at the time that we're excavating it, our methods of excavation and the control measures that we take, a lot of fill that could be acceptable may be rendered unacceptable, and then you have problems with your earthworks balance, possible processing, etc., to ensure that your acceptable material is okay for use. So I mentioned earlier about some of the environmental features that hasn't been possible to avoid with the route of the scheme. One example of that is Black Loch, which is a natural loch that occurs along the route, and there's a wetland habitat established around that lake. So it hasn't been possible to avoid that. Now, the historic mapping showed that the lake used to be significantly larger, but it's still estimated that the road embankment is going to cause loss of 20% of the habitat associated with that wetland. Now, there's a culvert that outfalls from that lake into the main lake, and one potential issue is that we're going to dewater the lake somehow, so that if the culvert is done at an incorrect level, we could change the hydrology in the area. So the special measure is going to be taken within that culvert to control water levels within the loch and ensure the habitat remains close to what it is today in the end. But probably more significantly is the subsurface drainage regime. So you can see in the picture on the right hand side, dark brown is more of them soft and craggy bog areas. And the standard methodology through the scheme is for that peat to be excavated and replaced with rock and engineered fill. Because of the concerns around the lake at this particular area, within the environmental statement and the contract, it commits and obliges us that that embankment will be supported as a piled embankment, and that's to leave the peat in place so that the subsurface drainage regimes remain as consistent with the current conditions as possible. Getting into our structures then, I mentioned earlier the critical nature of the rail structures. So we have 14 overbridges, but the 2 rail bridges really are key for us in that they block us our ability to haul material through the site using dumpers. So they're real points that we need to get bridges in over to start getting material moving across them. So what we have is 2 concrete superstructures, substructures with precast, pre-tension TY beams sitting on bank seats behind reinforced earth retaining walls and engineered fill. That's what the rail bridges are. At the bottom of the picture, an example of the standard 3-span overbridges that you see all over the country. So there again, precast, pre-tensioned U-beams, and very similar to what you see elsewhere. I suppose at various points during today's discussion, we spoke about collaboration and maybe managing risk through design. An interesting feature of these bridges, perhaps you don't notice, is that downstand under the crosshead beam on the piers. Now it doesn't appear much, but there are clients in the UK where we have done projects that prohibit that crosshead beam being any lower than the soffit of the beam. But that prohibition means that in order to land those beams, you have significant temporary works to undertake to support these beams. Whereas when that downstand is permitted, you can construct your columns and the crosshead to that level, and that gives you a platform to land those beams onto, thereby eliminating a huge amount of temporary works and the risks associated with it. So I suppose what's an aesthetic consideration for some clients in relation to the prohibition of that downstand, can add significant complication into how the bridge is to be constructed. I suppose overall there's about 10,000 cubic metres of structural concrete, 30,000 cubic metres of concrete in total on the scheme, and about 200 precast beams. I suppose going back to what I touched on there and how we manage the health and safety through the process and the environmental issues, we work closely with our designers who are working at all times to try and eliminate risk via design where practicable. So those guys are working and we're giving input in terms of our consideration as a contractor as to what items within that design are posing particular risks for us or things that we consider can be eliminated. And in the example I gave there, in the instance where it's not within our gift to eliminate those risks due to contractual requirements, we will go back and discuss with the client, is it possible to look at this in another way? Can we amend these requirements? Because we think ultimately there's going to be a safer product or an easier way to do this with maybe some slight adjustments. So where it isn't possible to eliminate those risks, our designers clearly communicate to us the risks that they see inherent within the designs they're giving us, particularly the ones that mightn't be apparent to us as a contractor in relation to assumed construction sequences for bridges, which can be very important in terms of the stability of the bridge during construction. So what we do then is ensure that those risks are flagged to our construction team, so that when they're drafting up method statements, their starting point is the residual risks that our designers have foreseen as being integral in that design or inherent within that design. And then obviously any other risks that our own guys consider in their experience are added on to that to ensure that we mitigate and control those risks. Similar process in relation to our ecology. We've had the ecologists out there. The ecologists are out there to update ecology surveys that have previously been undertaken, confirm to us what the status on the ground is now, and then ensure that we can try and eliminate ecological impacts where possible, and ensure that disturbance to protected species, etc., is minimised. This is a high risk item for us because not only have you constraints upon seasons where certain ecology surveys can be undertaken, if you then find items on site that weren't expected, there can be significant constraints in terms of the seasons that anything can be done with those constraints. So between the delay in being ability to survey certain things at certain times a year and then to carry out the necessary measures to mitigate it can have a significant impact on construction programmes. I suppose what I've dealt with there is really mitigating the impact, but also as part of the scheme, we're required to develop habitat enhancement plans for certain areas within the works, a lot of landscaping commitments, provide an overall enhancement to the area. So it's not just a case of mitigating the impact, there is an aspect of enhancement within these road schemes for the area. So I suppose the final steps in our health and safety obligations then is collating that safety file, as-built documents and as-built information for the client. We're going to run and maintain the asset. We ensure when we're handing that over that it contains information around end-of-life demolition of structures, drainage maintenance regimes, dual carriageway, the sections of demountable barriers, so you deal with traffic management plans of how the road could be maintained, lanes closed, counterflows set up. So say one scenario that is dealt with in that contract is a load instance where there's very heavy traffic coming into Castlebar and then all using every available route to Westport immediately after. Now, I'm not entirely certain, but I have speculated. It is referred to in the contract as Scenario SAM. So, given the current status of the Mayo team, I think we have enough time to get the route complete. So, James Horn will have them back up to speed. There'll be a party in Castlebar initially, and then everyone is going to use the road to get to Westport for night 2 and 3 and 4. Look, thanks very much for your attention. I'll hand you back to Ed.
Jared, no? Any questions for the panel? Oh, sorry.
Quick question. Doesn't matter. No, it's fine. Quick question for Alan. If you don't mind. Congratulations on the project. First and foremost, it sounds like your construction management of the year award is well deserved. Really impressive project. I suppose the question I have is if it was design build or employer designed, and particularly around the project's very impressive. It has everything in it. Conservation, new build, train site. But the temporary works and the scaffolding, I found really interesting. It was self-an-area project, I suspect, and particularly if it was employer designed for a tender period, tends to be much shorter. I'm just wondering, I suppose, in terms of number one, the opportunity to foresee how complex that operation is going to be, and the sequencing of that is going to be. And number two, I suppose, for allowing in terms of your program, if there was enough time given for that, just in terms of, I suppose, lessons from the design side. As someone who came from a design background, you know, it's a project in itself, and I know something I've come across in the industry is a lot is contractors saying that the temporary works in a tender period, they often can't foresee how long that's going to take or the cost it's going to take, and just it seems to be a very collaborative project, and I'm just wondering if that was foreseen and well planned. Long question, sorry.
Very short answer to that question. No is the answer.
Not enough.
It was, just to go back to your first question, it was client-led design. They employed the design team. It wasn't a design and build from our respect. The scaffolding was probably, you know, I'm not talking out of school here when I say we probably lost our shirt on the scaffolding. It was almost double what we had allowed for originally. We didn't take into, well, not that we didn't take into tradition, we couldn't have foreseen the amount of times the scaffolding had to go up and down, or due to how tight the whole site was, that we were having to use the scaffolding itself as part of the temporary structure. If that makes sense, to land the steel on it. And that only came out in the wash as the project continued on. It was such a fluid thing. So the scaffolding was in flux all the time. It was continuously being designed and reused for things. The durations had stayed up longer in certain areas than we had anticipated, and in other areas it was up and down. And as we got towards the end of the project, the scaffolding was fouling because it was being built around a church hall. It was fouling the works on the ground, so we couldn't crack on with the finishes. There was underfloor heating and tiling and painting, and everything still had to be done at a lower level. But because the building above was being supported by that scaffolding, it was making a mess of our program. So I may not have explained it well or had a decent picture of it, but we ended up having to hang a scaffolding from the third floor beneath to allow the electricians to install, you know, basic things that you didn't give consideration at the time, was how you put a light bulb into a light fitting that's above another building, above the church hall roof. There's a light on the other side of that wall. How do you maintain it? How do you wire it? How do you paint the ceiling? That, in effect, meant that we had to have access there right until the end of the project. But the longer that scaffolding was there, beneath, everything else suffered. So we came up with the idea to hang the scaffolding and had to get approval from the architect, because it ended up leaving these little discs all over his beautiful concrete coffered ceiling. And we had to, so if you unscrew one of the discs now, there's a socket, female socket, that you can put a piece of thread or bar into it and effectively do the same again. So we sold to the clients on a kind of long term. We said, you know, if you need to get out there to change that light bulb, this is what you're going to have to do. And we were able to do that. So, but scaffolding was a major thing for us that we probably didn't pick up.
Can I ask you, have fear of triangles?
Yeah, somebody has a love of triangles. Anyway, we used to slag the architect about that. But
Any more questions? Yeah, Justin.
Sir, just one there for Paul. You just made reference there, Paul, that in relation to the Grenfell project there and the government, the UK government produced a report. We did something similar, I suppose. Our government produced a report in April 2012 called Strengthening the Building Control System, and that was a result of a number of failures in relation to building regulations in this country. And you made a reference there at one stage too in relation to the race to the bottom and the lowest price wins. But do you think anything is going to change? Like, I mean, as they say, every time you have a bad project, it's not just necessarily the contractor, sometimes you can have a bad client as well. So really the process has to, this whole process of change and quality control really has to start at the design client stage so that it's reintroduced into the construction stage. It's very difficult for the contractor per se to do everything, you know, in isolation.
It's a really important point, and I think it's an area that, you know, a part of me wants to think as an industry, you know, we'll get it and we'll start to bring about the change. But the reality, I think, in the UK in particular, is there's a recognition that there's going to have to be regulation. There are going to have to be sanctions to try and drive the right sort of outcomes, the right sort of behaviours. In the meantime, though, I think, and I'm encouraged, I mean, the Industry Safety Steering Group meets every 2 months, and we hear from a variety of different representatives from the industry. And the last meeting we had, which was back at the beginning of February, we heard from developers who are actually not waiting for the legislation; they're already taking the initiative. And it does begin. I agree. I mean, it's got to be driven by clients, I think, to some extent. Although I also think there's an onus on designers and on contractors to start adopting the right behaviours. And I say this is you know, I need to emphasise, which is why I wanted to put up the example of La Crosse Tower. And some of you may have been following this as an issue, would have noted the Opal Tower scheme in Australia, which had to be fully vacated, high-rise residential tower to be vacated within months of completion because of structural cracking in the building. So, you know, this isn't a UK-wide only issue. I think for me, this change that we're expecting the industry to undergo is essentially cultural, and it's interesting. There's a recognition that of what the factors are that are driving some of those behaviours. Procurement. I mean, it's interesting. I was reading this morning the second phase of the inquiry, into the Grenfell Tower fire. The public inquiry is now happening. And if anyone's been looking at it, it's just started again after a brief hiatus. And the first on the stand is the architect. And the first thing to come out of interviewing the architect is that the Kensington and Chelsea TMO bypassed OJEU regulations to get the architect they wanted onto the scheme by essentially agreeing a fee with them which was not sufficient to provide the service, but was below the OJEU limit. And you kind of go, come on, guys, this is, you end up with this sort of slightly the law of unintended consequences. But so I think, it's interesting that within the Building Safety Act, there is intended to introduce whistleblowing protections for people. So I think it's a combination. I think unfortunately it will require legislation and sanctions because people need to know that if they don't comply with legislation, there are consequences. But I think as an industry, I'd like to think we're already waking up to the fact that the leading contractors and consultants are going to start adopting the right practices and behaviours now. And there are encouraging signs. As I said, the developers who are already starting to basically say we're going to adopt best practice. We're not going to try and cut corners. And contractors who, simple things like contractors who are already on site are keeping a full photo. It sounds so obvious, doesn't it? Doing a photographic record of fire stopping. It amazes me that something as simple as that we just don't know because, I've had it on a development of mine recently where I've got a well-known national contractor who's gone back into a building a year after PC to make good 200 defects in fire stopping for a building that was signed off by building control and independently inspected by a fire consultant. And yet a subsequent investigation found that, they put their hands up and said, we'll sort it out. But, if you talk to them about one of my bête noirs at the moment, it is the fire stopping industry. It's the fact that anybody, I don't know whether this is the same in Ireland, but pretty much anyone can roll up in a van with a tube of fire mastic. And which touches on this issue of, how these people, trained, how they do they need licensing, things like this. So, yeah, I think it's a really big area and it's a really important question. But it is, for me, I think it is a combination of changing behaviours and the requirement for legislation to drive some of that change as well.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Great afternoon session, I think, and it just shows the diversity of the work I think we're capable of in the industry, what's taken with the presentations. I've just asked Head of School Gerard McMichael to formally propose a vote of thanks. I'd just like to acknowledge Gerard's participation during the decade of the conference. More often than not, he's been the very last speaker at the tail end of the conference when attention spans are waning, and they stuck manfully to the task. You've been a very good sport, Gerard, so thank you for your support over the years. Thank you.
You're welcome, Markham. Thanks for those remarks. I always admire the last speakers in the last session on a conference like today. Not only do they have to keep you awake, but they actually have to engage you. And I think there was lots of evidence that happened here this afternoon, so well done, everyone. One of the things of this conference, now 10 years old in the making, is that it has become a touchstone for the need for the construction sector identity in the west of Ireland. And that's very much evidence in this conference today. I'll just give you a few figures of today's attendance to illustrate that. We had over 150 CPD cert requests from professional bodies representing our three main sponsors, but also other professional bodies like CIPD and Engineers Ireland. We also had stakeholders from large construction companies, design offices, small construction companies, and from the public sector such as the HSA and the OPW. I won't leave out the students. We had over 150 of them from GMIT in the main, but also from CIT and WIT. And every year we continue to attract that interest.
the students come along not just to maybe meet potential employers. It was announced this morning that we had a very successful Careers Day earlier. They also come along to understand what construction is about. And this conference for them is part of their engagement with the sector that, along with work placement, primes them for a job ready to go with the appropriate skills, profile and attitude so that they can fit in with you as an employer. So we're very pleased about that. In terms of the conference itself, it was interesting to note the number of female speakers that we had. If you ask the man in the street about the construction sector, they will probably, and very likely, characterize it as overwhelmingly male. But there still are females here this afternoon in the audience, quite a number of them. And we had a number of prominent, high-positioned females as our speakers today. And that augurs well for the EDI, objective of GMIT, and for every other organisation in the country. So that's one developmental dimension of the sector that's often overlooked. In GMIT, I'm not suggesting that we're paragons of virtue in this, but over a half of the staff in building and civil engineering are females, and under a third in the whole School of Engineering are females. So we are exemplars, in a sense, for females to enter the career of construction in some way or form. I mentioned the engagement of students within this conference. Of course, it's very important that the staff in the Department of Building and Civil continue to align our courses with the needs of the sector. And we do that partly through a conference like this, but in the main through engagement with industry, through work placement, through applied and active research, which we've begun to do over the last 10 years, and which has stimulated a number of our staff to do doctorates in the area, including Martin himself as an expert now on construction, lean construction, I think is the term. So it just remains for me to thank our three major sponsors, along with our three major professional bodies who have sponsored us, the CIOB, the SCSI, CABE, and the CIF. So a round of applause for them. To thank all of you for coming to reinvent the conference each and every year to make sure that it remains resonant and vibrant with what you want to say, what you want to hear, and who you want to engage and network with. So a round of applause for yourselves. For our students who have also come, and they're still here, I can see the faces. I've explained to you how important the conference is for them, so a round of applause for them. And then for the hosts are staff of the Department of Building and Civil Engineering. Martin is the chief bottle washer, supported by Mary Rogers, the head of Building and Civil Engineering, and all his colleagues in the department. So a big round of applause for all of them, please. And finally, we look forward to seeing you next year, hopefully. Thank you. One more thing. As the 10th anniversary, we have a presentation from Mary to Martin. It's no secret what it is. I think it's a bottle of wine. Bottle of whiskey.